So one of the most daunting things about Unreal Engine is opening up a fresh project and trying to remember all the settings, checkboxes, console variables, drop-down menus, plugins, and other little things that you need to check along the way just to get started. The goal of this video is to make a simple default template project that could work with most 3D art scenes, whether it's product viz, studio lighting setups, cinematic architectural stuff, or anything related to that matter, abstract art even. We'll go through content browser organization, setting up your outliner, having the right post-process volume settings, basic sequences setups, all the little console variable render settings that you'd want, and hopefully that way you can only do it once, and then you can also literally make it a template that pops up in your Unreal Engine launcher when you launch whatever version you have installed. There's also two people I'd love to give a huge shout out to first, which is Luke from Fast Chaos and obviously William Foucher or Fauché. I don't know how to say it. I've definitely used some tips and tricks from both of their videos, so definitely check these two out if you want to learn more. Especially Luke has a really great breakdown and also some documentation on certain console variables that I'm not using all of them today, but if you do have extra things you want to take care of, especially if you're doing more motion graphics heavy stuff, definitely check out his video. He has a great template that is also available. If this is helpful, please like and subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, so I've just opened up the Epic Games launcher and I'm in the Unreal Engine tab and then the library tab within that. As you can see here, this is what we will be making. And as I mentioned in my intro, this is the template project that Luke did from Fast Chaos, a great motion graphics template, as well as a few other tips and things that you can definitely learn from. So definitely, again, check that out. Okay, so step one is we are going to launch Unreal Engine. I'm using 5.3.2, as you can see. Okay, so this window will pop up. I'm just going to minimize the launcher. Next thing we will do is go down to the architecture tab and then select blank. And now you will want to choose where your project location will be, as well as the name of the project. I'm just going to call this default project _toot for tutorial, and then hit create. So this should be what you see come up first, is the complete default startup. All the things in your outliner should be here. There won't be any content drawer at the bottom, and you can press Control Space to bring that up. The next thing I'm going to do layout wise of the UI is actually just bring up the content drawer and then just dock it in the layout, because that is personally how I like to use it. I'm coming from Unreal Engine 4 and it's just something I'm used to, but up to you if you want to do that or not. Now the next thing I'm going to do is set up the folders in the content browser so we can organize all our assets when importing things or creating different assets within Unreal. So the first few folders will be, if you just right click anywhere and then go new folder, I'm going to do 00_levels and then new folder 01_geometry 02_materials and then 03_sequencer and then 04_assets. Next, I'm going to change the colors of the folders so that they're easily recognizable. So you just right click, set color, and I'll make this a brighter orange. And then for geometry, I like to typically make it green for some reason. And then materials, I will make it pink and a bit brighter. And then sequencer, I like to make it red. And then lastly, assets, I will make a light blue. Something like that. So that's the basic folder hierarchy that I like to use. Not everyone likes to use this method, but for simple, I guess, 3D art or product viz scenes, I think it works quite well and it can be easily manipulated. But if you do have, a specific hierarchy that you like to work with, whether it's setting up a comps folder with subcomps and then everything in there, you can do it that way. So it's totally up to you. One thing to note is when you do import plugins or add-ons or anything, they will go in this content folder on the right here, or like adding it to the rest of the list. So definitely keep in mind that all of these folders will have things that you've created and organized, and then all the extra stuff will come out here. So that is also why I like to color code these folders, so that when I import a bunch of other extras, they don't mess with, you know, my typical folder structure. Now later on, when we make our blank startup scene, I will be making some subfolders within these, but I will go through that in a sec. For now, let's just set up the project settings and the editor preferences. So first thing you want to do is go up to the edit and then project settings. Next, just type in ray tracing and just make sure all of these guys are checked, specifically hardware ray tracing as well as detail tracing for the software ray tracing mode. The next thing we want to search for is if you type in ray and then find ray lighting mode, and I like to change this from surface cache to hit lighting, and if you hover over it, it'll say this method gives the highest reflection quality but greatly increases GPU costs. So pretty much this is the better reflection method for calculating more accurate and high quality reflections. Obviously will eat up performance, but the goal of this is not for game development or real-time environments. It'll be for rendering cinematics and sequences out or previs content. Now I'm just going to type in shadows, and we just want to make sure ray trace shadows is enabled. Now the last two project settings I want to change alpha channel support. So when we're rendering out alphas and we want that to be included in the image data when rendering. So if I type in alpha, enable alpha channel support in post-processing, and I just want to make sure it's on linear color space only. It will ask you to restart now. However, we just want to enable a few plugins before doing so, and then we'll just do a full restart of the project. And then last setting, if I just type in near clipping, I like to change mine from 10 down to 2, because if I'm working with smaller products or objects in general, and I don't want my camera to clip the object when doing a detail shot, this will allow me to do that and not cut into the object itself. So that pretty much wraps it up for the basic project settings. The next thing we want to do is go to edit and then plugins, and then just enable any plugins that you are commonly going to use in this. For me, it's definitely modeling tools, which is already on for me. It might not be for you, but this is this guy right here, which lets you model objects within Unreal as well as edit imported geometry, which can be super useful. The next thing I want to check is Cineware. So that's also enabled for me as well, because I definitely use that a lot in my workflow. And then the last thing is my Grayscale Gorilla plugin, which I personally like to check on because I use their library a lot. So for me personally, those are the main plugins that I like to enable. There's definitely a lot more, especially related to motion graphics or character rigging or VFX kind of things. But for me, I don't really need that at the moment, at least in my default template. And I kind of just like to pick and choose when I do want to enable those plugins, depending on my project. So now the next thing we will do is actually click restart later, close it, and then close the project, because we do want to change the config file just a tiny bit before we start the project up again. So just close, and it should already be saved. If it doesn't, make sure you select save when it prompts you. Now we want to navigate to our project folder. So I'm just in my project folder that I just made, and we want to go to config and then default engine.ini. So just double click that and open it with any text editor. And the only settings I want to add, or console variables or startup console variables I want to add, is to allow for nanite displacement or tessellation. So the first one you want to add is r.nanite.allow tessellation equals 1, and then r.nanite.tessellation equals 1. And I've added that under the render settings area, and just at the bottom, no spaces or anything, and that's all you need to do. And then you just hit Control S to save it, and then you can close it, and that's all you need to do. Now we can start up our project again, which you can either do through the template, through the Epic Games launcher here, and just double click it, or you can go to your default project and just double click this guy, and that'll do the exact same thing. It might take a while for your shaders to compile, so don't freak out if that does happen. It's because we've enabled a bunch of things and it needs to recompile all the shaders that are already in the project. Okay, so now that our project has been started up again, hopefully you guys have been able to follow along and it's not too confusing. And also if there are any of you out there who have other project setting recommendations or console variable startup commands, do let me know, please. So the next thing we want to do is set up our own default level rather than using this built-in one here so that we can start fresh. So the first thing I want you to do is go into your levels folder and then right click and then do level. And I like to do L for level underscore, I'll do example underscore A. So that'll be my first example level, and then just double click it, save selected, and it should be a completely blank project. The next thing I want you to do is go back to your project settings, and then on the left, go to maps and modes and change the editor startup map from main to this level we just created, and then also game default map to this level that we also just created. So the reason we're doing this is that when we open up the project for the first time, it'll open up our new level that we just made rather than the default one that we just were in. And the next thing we can now do safely is go back to our content browser and delete these three objects and folders right here, because that is the old startup map that we don't really care about. So just select them, hit delete, delete, and then delete folder, yes, delete again, and now we're done. We have a clean content browser that is ready for us to populate. Now the next thing we'll do is set up the base geometry for the scene. So as you saw in my earlier thumbnail, the geometry I imported was pretty much just one of these little psych geometry things that I used the Grayscale Gorilla plugin for, and then one of these figures in Cinema 4D just for scale. So I'll just export those out as an FBX and then import them in. Just have your base default geometry ready. I would recommend something plain and also something that you would commonly use either as a background or a backdrop for your renders. So when importing these things, I will obviously go into my geometry folder, and then I'll create a new folder called example A, or I'll just name it whatever the level is called, so that, you know, it's all organized and all my static meshes that are relevant to that level are in a folder. And then within that folder, I'll create another one called 01, because sometimes I'll have multiple variations or versions or re-imports of a thing. So say I have a variation, I'll call it 02 or 01B, that kind of thing. This is just personally how I like to organize it, but it's totally up to you guys, whatever you want to do. So 01, and then we just go import. I'm just going to navigate to my geometry. I'm just going to import an FBX. Now that's in, we can close the message log. I'm just going to drag mine in and then 0 their coordinates out. And if I go to Alt 3, which is unlit mode, and these are the different shortcuts I highly recommend you get used to using. We're just going between wireframe, lit mode, unlit, and the reason we're doing unlit is because we have no lights in our scene yet, so we definitely want to be able to see everything. And as you can see, it's pretty much the same setup, but I've just made that background a lot wider and deeper. Cool, so the next thing I will do is select my figure, and I'm going to press F to focus on him. That way you can zoom on him. So say you're out somewhere in your viewport and you don't know where you are, just select an object, press F, and then it'll take you to that guy. And the first thing I will do is add a light, a rectangular light, and drag that guy in. And now I can press Alt 4 to go back to lit mode. And now we have a light in our scene. And actually what I want to do is go from lit mode to lighting only, I believe. And that pretty much takes us to a white card view. As you can see, there's like auto exposure happening when I move in and out, depending on where my camera is focused. We can disable that, and we'll set all of that up later on in a post-process volume. All right, cool. So now that I have my light, now I want to make my base camera setup. So I typically like to make 3 different cameras. So we just want to go to the plus icon and then go to cinematic cine camera actor and just drag that guy in. And as you can see, if I move my camera around, we have a little preview here. Now this is the next thing I want to do with our viewport, is have a multi-viewport setup. So our render view on one side and our regular viewport on the other side. And what we can do is click this little minimize or maximize viewport button here, and that'll make a 4-pane view. I personally like to use a 2-pane view, so we're just going to click this little left menu icon and then go down to layouts and then 2 panes. Awesome. And now what we can do is from this drop down go to perspective, and now we've got 2 perspectives. And then we can also make sure you have real time on, so just click that button if you see it pop up, and then from the drop down menu choose Cine Camera Actor. And now if I move in here, you can see this is our cinema camera that we just made, and you'll notice it's super fast in the beginning. What I'm doing is changing the speed in this top right here. The shortcut to do that is while you're moving around, so I'm holding right click and moving around, you just scroll in and scroll up or scroll down to increase or decrease the speed, or you can just reduce it here with the slider. So I'm actually going to, that was a weird bug. Whoa, I've never seen that before. So I'm actually going to zero out my camera's coordinates and rotation, drag him out. My rotation snapping is on, so I can rotate this guy 90 degrees. I'm going to change from lit mode to lighting only, so that we're all in the white card, and then place my camera somewhere there. The next thing I want to do is actually make this left viewport a cinematic viewport. So what we can do is hit this menu again, hit this perspective menu, and then from default change it to cinematic. That'll reset both of your viewports and take you out of the camera view, but it's not a big deal. Now you just go back into that menu, hit Cine Camera Actor, and what this allows you to do is actually have composition overlays as well as have the timeline in your viewport whenever you are creating a sequence. So I'm just going to turn the grid on, and that way I can nicely compose my scene. Now the next thing we're going to do is add in the post-process volume. So first let me just actually move this light more to the right, kind of rim this area a bit, and then drag him this way, rotate it. And now we kind of have a really basic lighting setup. I probably wouldn't do it as uniform as this, but maybe something like that. Okay, so for our post-process volume, this is super important. It kind of drives the whole look of our scene, as well as controls, a lot of the settings, whether it's the quality of our reflections or how auto exposure works, or if you have bloom or lens flares and all of that sort of stuff. So let's now bring that in. I'm just going to turn off my grid, and then in this top plus menu here, just go down to volumes and then find post-process volume. Another thing you can do is, say you just have clicked this button here and your mouse is hovering over the button, you can just start typing in post-process volume and then just click that guy and it'll jump into your scene. First setting that we want to change is make it unbound or have an infinite extent. All that means is we don't have to be inside the volume for the effects to take place. It's going to cover or encompass our whole world. Now the next thing I want to do is, you'll see I have these favorites selected, but you will not. So let me just remove them for now, and then I'll show you how to add them. Super useful, by the way. So the first thing we want to do is adjust our auto exposure. So I'm going to go to min and max EV after typing expo for exposure, and then make it 0 and 0. And now you can see our exposure is locked. We don't have any auto exposure happening. And then we can use this exposure compensation slider, or we can use the one in our camera. I think I prefer to use the one in camera so that my different cameras can have certain levels of exposure. But what I first would like to do is maybe get my lighting to a good base level and then adjust exposure after that. So maybe I would increase this to something like 25 and bring it in a bit, or expand the encompassing fall off radius, which is just with the scale tool, which I'm pressing R to do, as you can see here. You can also adjust the attenuation radius. That's the word I was looking for, the attenuation radius here. And then maybe turn up the brightness a bit more if you'd like. And I'll also turn the brightness up of this guy to maybe 10 or 20, and then go back to this guy, try to make this a bit stronger, maybe something like that. It's a little overexposed, so maybe something like 100 could be good, but something like that could be nice for a basic studio setup. So let's jump back into our post-process volume. We'll go down to exposure. So we'll leave that on 1 for now, but what I will do is right-click it and add to favorites. So now we don't need to type in exposure every time, we'll just have it here at the top of our details panel list. The next thing I'll do is disable bloom. So go to bloom, turn that intensity down to 0, and I will also add that to favorites. It is kind of annoying, like it just says intensity, it doesn't say bloom intensity, so that's something I hope Epic changes in the UI later on. And the next thing we'll disable or turn to 0 is the lens flare, so just type in flare, go down to 0. And then I'm also going to add that to my favorites. So I have bloom intensity, exposure, and my lens flare intensity. Now the next thing we want to change or adjust is our lumen settings. So if I go down to lumen, we want to make sure our lumen scene lighting quality is turned up and our lumen scene detail are also turned up to 4. I'm pretty much just turning up all the quality sliders that I need. This as well, final gather quality, I like to turn up. Lumen reflections, definitely up to 2. Ray lighting mode, because we already made it hit lighting, it should be there by default, but just to make sure, I'll make hit lighting for reflections. High quality translucency, and then I'll change my max reflection bounces to 4. So those are generally the lumen settings that I like to adjust in my post-process. There's definitely a lot more fine tuning you can do with, view distance and max trace distance and all that, but as a base setup, this is personally what works quite well for me. And one last setting I want to add is to the favorites, is the bloom threshold. So if we just type in bloom again, go down to threshold and add that to the favorites. That way, say we have super high bloom intensity, we can now play with the threshold, which areas of the scene will it cull out that will give the bloom effect. So those are pretty much the 4 main settings that I like to have available in my post-process volume. I'm just going to turn that back down to 0. I usually like to add in those effects after I've set up all my camera shots. Now, I mentioned earlier that I like to have multiple cameras set up in my default level. So as you can see, we've kind of set up our classic wide 16:9 shot. And I also have some favorites or some settings favorited here as well. Let's definitely add those now. And one thing I actually do like to change from the default settings is changing it from digital film to DSLR. And then you can sort of bring that in. Maybe something like that if you like. And the settings that I like to add to my favorites are focus distance for the first one. So if you scroll down to focus settings, I like to add manual focus distance to my favorites. The next thing is the cropped aspect ratio. So this is pretty much changing different aspect ratios, which I will go through in a second. And that is also down here somewhere, crop settings, cropped aspect ratio. And if you can't find these guys, you can also just type it in and it'll pop up there. The next thing I want to add is the current focal length. So lens settings, where is it? No, down here in the underneath crop settings. So current focal length I'll add to my favorites, and the default is 35. And then the last 2 things is the aperture, which is underneath the focal length, add that to the favorites, and then also exposure compensation. So this is where I might change the exposure on the camera, but not of the whole scene, because it depends on on a shot to shot basis. So let me just set that to default, and you can just type in exposure compensation and that'll appear. Right click and then add to favorites. So this could be a decent first camera that I would set up, and then again my basic light. So let me update the lighting a little bit here. So probably one thing I would do is, if I set this back to default, turn off my first light, I'd probably make this like a soft fill light coming from the top, but I'd almost want it to be a softer rim as well, more like highlighting the background. And then I'll zero it out in the coordinates. And because I want it to be softer, I'll make it larger. so it has more of a soft fill. And then I could even make it something like 10, probably make it a bit wider there, make it like 15. Cool. And then I kind of will have my key light here. So let me move that around, maybe something like there. Probably turn down the brightness a bit. Something around there could be good. And then I'm just going to hold Alt and drag it to copy it. And then also do, maybe I'll just reduce the attenuation radius of this guy a bit. Or maybe he could be my key light. Something like that could work. A really crude studio lighting setup, but something like that could work. I'm not a huge fan of all these trailing shadows in different directions, so maybe I make this guy a bit bigger to have softer shadows. 150, and then also bring in his attenuation radius. And if you, another tip by the way, to change your pivot point from local to global, Control tilde, or you can click this button here. And as you can see, if you hover over it, it says Control tilde to change that. So that way you can keep it on that same axis if you want. So we can just leave it there for now. So say this is our basic studio setup that we are happy with. This will be our first camera. So I'll typically call it cam_01_landscape_wide. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's personally how I like to label it, just so I know the different cameras I'm looking at. And then I will select the camera and hit Control D and make sure I pilot that new camera that we just made. And I will make this guy a portrait. So if I'm doing something for Instagram or a reel or something like that. So portrait. And that for Instagram, I think is 0.5625. And then make sure he's zeroed out. Cool. And we just want to get the manual focus distance, get the eyedropper, and then select our subject here. And we can, move it up a bit, move it in. I can maybe even up the focal length to something like a 50, which is a bit nicer. And then you might need to adjust the focus distance again. Or what we could do, and something I definitely like to do, is if you go to this drop down here and do basic actor, just zero out his location, bring him up. And I'm just going to turn off this grid so that we can move objects smoothly, this grid snapping. We can put our, our actor here, which is just, think of it as like an empty null in Cinema 4D or whichever software you're in. It's just a basic point in space. And I'm going to select this actor, rename it focus_01, select our camera. And then instead of changing the focus method from manual, I will choose tracking. And then if I do the drop down on the menu here, select my focus 1. So now my focus will always be following this actor that we've placed here. So really useful for keeping a constant focus point when placing cameras. That way you don't need to constantly change it, especially if you're animating a camera or something like that. And I'll do the same with the wide shot. So manual, tracking, actor to track, focus 01. Now, one thing I do find annoying is these little camera previews here, because I like to use a 2-pane view, and also this does take up and eat up performance. So one thing I like to do is disable the camera preview. So what you can do is go up to editor preferences. So edit, editor preferences, type in preview, and then scroll down, preview selected cameras, and then I will uncheck that. and now we won't get that little window, annoying window to pop up. But some people like it. It's really personal preference. Cool. And then the last camera that I'll set up, oh, and also I got to rename it from cam01 to cam02. And then the last camera I'll set up is I'll do Control D again, go to cam03, and instead of wide, I will do close. So let me pilot my cam03, which is this guy, and now I might have it be more like a detail shot, something like that. Whatever works. You can even, duplicate this wide, call it cam04, and then instead of portrait, I would call it square, and then pilot this square guy here. And then just change the aspect ratio from this to 1, and that'll give you a square aspect ratio. And there you go. That's pretty much it for all the camera setups. Alright, I know I've said a lot, so I hope you are still surviving, and if you are, please like and subscribe. Alright, that's all the self-marketing and promo I'm gonna do. Now, the final thing we want to do is actually clean up the outliner a bit and organize our different objects as well as naming conventions and all that sort of stuff. So, what I like to do in my projects is create a few different folders. Again, that is numbered so that the hierarchy stays consistent. So my first one will be called 00 effects. Then my next one will be called 01 geometry. Then I'll do 02 lighting, and then new folder 03 underscore cameras. And then what we can do is just select all these guys, drag them into camera. I don't know why I said that weird. Drag these guys, put it into geometry, and then within geometry you could even have like a subfolder and call it scene. And then you'd put your background in scene, and then this guy could be the product or something. And then I like to drag my post-process volume into effects. And in effects is where I'd have, things like my exponential height fog or volumetric fog stuff, any of that sort of environmental effect sort of thing, as well as VFX stuff, whether it's particles and things like that, would go into effects. And then lastly is my lighting, so drag these guys into here. And for my lighting, actually, I also like to name each light just to keep track of them. So for example, this guy I'll call L underscore fill, and then you can do fill BG if you want. And then this guy can be L underscore right or right fill. I don't know if it's exactly a fill, but it kind of is. And then this, for example, would be L underscore key, and then I'll do L. Also, I just realized I've done the positioning incorrect. So L for left, so this would be on the right, and then this guy would be on the left. So that's my left fill, that is my right fill, and that is my background fill and fall off. And then if you close these guys up, this is pretty much the basic folder setup. And then again, like I said, you could have scene, you could have foliage, whatever, however you like to organize your scene. Now, the final thing before we jump into the next part, which will be a lot simpler and more fun to show you guys, the last thing we want to do that I find very useful is setting up content browser filters. So that's these guys right here. I have mentioned this in previous tutorials, but I'm just going to go over it again because I think it's very relevant. So these just let you filter through a bunch of different objects in your scene, so that, for example, I'll show you here, if I add sorry, I don't know I did that, level filter, now it'll show me all the levels in my scene, and then I would add typically, where is it, a Datasmith scene. When I import Datasmith files and objects, then I would do level sequence. I would also do blueprint class and materials, material instance, and texture. What else? Static mesh for sure. Do I have anything else? So I'm looking at my reference screenshot on the right. I think that's all of it. Oh, and also lastly, material function. The annoying thing is you can't like reorder these once they're done. So in the order you enable them is the order they appear. So what I would actually do is probably make sure all my material stuff is grouped together. But again, not a huge deal. But this is really useful for just quickly going through different folders. If you want to check this folder and you want to quickly see all the static meshes, or you're in geometry and you just want to filter out the static meshes or textures that come imported, things like that. And then the last thing that can help with productivity moving around your scene is go up to Window, Content Browser, and then Content Browser 2, and then you can drag that guy here, and that way you can have two different content browsers available. So one could be your material folder, and then the other one could be, your geometries folder or your levels folder, things like that. That way you can easily go between different assets without, constantly clicking through things. And then another layout window I like to have is my layers window, which will pop up right here in the top right. Really good for setting up your different actor layers and things like that. You can learn more about that in my render passes video if you want to separate different objects and organize things as well as render them out separately. And that is pretty much it. Some other useful ones could be light mixer. Levels is definitely useful if you have persistent levels and sub levels, but you don't really need to worry about that at the moment, especially if you are new to the software. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's jump into the actual final default project that I have set up, and I will show you a few more details about the folder hierarchy and things like that. Okay, so this is the default template that I personally use and have just recently refreshed and set up. So as you can see, the exact same folder hierarchy here and up here. This Grayscale Gorilla folder appears when you import the different assets that they have, and when they do get imported, you can still change the color of them if you would like, so that's really useful. These different objects you see on your screen can actually be made in the modeling mode. As you can see here, stairs, sphere, cylinder. So I've just kind of placed them in certain positions and set up my cameras the exact same as I showed you before. And you can see here, I've actually labeled it a lot more simple: light background, light key light, and then my geometry, just really basic scene setup. And then I have my, different objects here that you can see, and then effects, same thing, post-process, volume, all the exact same as I showed you before. Now in the content browser, this is where I do set up different levels. So you'll see I have level example A, example B, example C. And in geometry, you'll notice I have two different folders for the different scenes I have. No geometry in there at the moment, but in case I do, I can put it here. So I've pre-made it. And in materials, you can see I have a few different material instances here, and where filters are useful, if I just want to look at my material instances, I can just select that and filter out all the other master materials. And if I want to only look at my master materials, I'll just click material here, and you can see all my master materials pop up, whether it's, this guy here, which is my basic material. If you want to learn more about that, check out my UE5 materials video, which is where I kind of create a very simple basic material. This obviously a lot more confusing looking, but the same exact thing. And I've added like a gradient function, which is how I do this with the materials. And I have a triplanar base and like a simple one, and then a noise one, which I've made a video on as well. And then this is just a Vincent Schwenk one that I made with some of his beautiful textures. So yeah, that's how I like to set up my materials folder. Is I'll do materials in one, and then I'll have material functions, so triplanar, material functions, gradient material function, and then I'll have a separate folder within that for my textures. So you can choose to either do your materials within the geometry folders so that it stays in the same spot. I like to have it here because I could use these materials across multiple levels, so that's what I'll do there. However, if I do have very object specific materials, I will sometimes, if I go to my assets folder, these are the different subfolders I have in my assets folder. So if I have some props, for example, these guys here, I have some storm ceramic vases and whatever this is, a jug. You could make those materials in this folder if you'd like, but again, I prefer to do it here and then, I don't know, make a folder and call it the same name as the prop. Totally up to you guys. And then here I have my different HDRIs, some simple gobos for my lights, any effects that you have like Niagara particle effects can go here, and then also any audio files that you have here that you would use with your animation. And speaking of animation, sorry, I'm talking a lot. In my sequencer folder, this is kind of how I set up my sequencer. So again, I'll just, like I did with geometry, make a folder that has the same name as the level, and then in it, I will have ls for level sequence, example A, which is the name of the level. So I'd go, you know, cinematic level sequence, call it ls underscore example A underscore s2, which is shot 2. And then you can set up whatever you want in there. And the final thing that we need to go through are the render settings. So to create your own render settings, all you can do is open up Movie Render Queue or open up any sequence that you have, even if it's blank, and then select this Movie Render Queue button. If you for some reason don't have this Movie Render Queue button available, just go to your edit menu here and then plugins, and then type in movie render. Yeah, so type in movie render queue, and it might not be enabled, and also enable the additional render passes so you have that functionality as well. This is just another example of weird settings that you might not know to check because Unreal can be weird like that. So just open up your movie render queue here, and if it's blank, you can just add a job, which is this guy here, a render job, and then go to unsaved config, and this is where you can set up all your render settings. So as you can see here in the drop down, I just have some really basic ones, a JPEG one, which is where I'm not really planning on doing much post on it at all. I'm just happy with how it looks. Maybe it's for social media or something like that, and I just want to render out some JPEGs. And then I also have some EXR options. You can definitely go way more in depth into this with, you know, ProRes, and whether it's for movie, linear, color space stuff, all of that. And again, big shout out to Luke from Fast Chaos and William Foucher, who have great videos, specifically William on the ACES workflow with Unreal to DaVinci Resolve or After Effects and things like that. You can totally watch his video, really helpful. And then Luke from Fast Chaos, he has a really great webpage with different console commands and console variables. I'll go through a few of them today, but he has a lot more that he can go through. And he also has a bunch of plugins that he likes to enable for his MoGraph, motion graphics workflow. So definitely check his video out, and also I'll link it below, but this webpage super useful if you just want to get into more details about each of these settings. So I'll just do a basic setup for one of my render settings. So say I'm doing a JPEG, this can stay the same, deferred rendering can stay the same. I just want to make sure my frame rate is set to 30. Next, I'll make it 3840 by 2160, and then in the settings I'll add anti-aliasing, change the temporal sample count to 16, and then override, make sure it's set to none. If you have a lot of motion, you might want to mix these values up. If you have a lot of motion, you might want to go, I don't know, 4 and 8, depending on what kind of scene you have. So definitely read up on the documentation about why this can be helpful. But I think if you do have fast moving objects, you might want to add more spatial counts, and you can definitely test both of these things. But as a default setting, 1 and 16 seems to work well for me. Next thing I want to do, actually before I add another setting, is make my warm-up count 32 and 32. That way the engine will warm up some frames before actually outputting a render image, so that there's no weird artifacts with shadows or movement or weird motion blur and things like that. The next thing is color output. So this is where if you do want to do your ACES workflow, you would do that here. Definitely, again, check out William's video on that. Kind of all you want to do is just select your ACES OCIO config, go from sRGB to ACES CG, and that's all you got to do for that. But I probably wouldn't do this because I'm doing a JPEG output, so I don't really need to worry about any of that color stuff at the moment. Next we want is console variables for sure, which is where we'll add in our console variable commands. The next thing is game overrides, so this will make sure everything is at max quality. You could do any of these guys for object IDs for render passes, but I would recommend doing that with EXRs because I found it works a lot more consistently with material IDs and things like that. Plus, if you're doing post and compositing, you'd want to use an EXR workflow anyways. So in console variables, again, the Notion site I was showing earlier from Luke has a lot, but these are the ones that I find to be the most useful. So our ray tracing .culling, I like to set to 0 because that'll make sure my shadows aren't clipping in and out from my camera depending on how far away I am from an object. The next thing I want to do is depth of field quality. And you can see here when I hover over it, 0 is off, 1 is low, 2 is high, and 4 is the highest quality. So I just want to make sure that it's on 4. I think by default it is, but it's just something I like to do because I'm weird. The next thing I'll do is screen percentage. I just like to set this at 100. The next thing is foliage settings, so force LOD 0. That way the foliage isn't upping its LODs or LODs based on the camera distance, and it stays at highest quality at all times. Another one I like to use is force LOD 0 for all my geometry. So that way your geometry stays at LOD 0 and again doesn't go to lower qualities if you're importing in different assets that have built-in LODs. And the last thing that I got from Luke actually was the motion blur. Motion blur, where is separable? There it is. So this adds a second motion blur pass that smooths noise for a higher quality motion blur. So that one we want to set to 1. Oh, and the last thing that I like to add is this camera tab. Depends on how you like to do your shutter with the motion blur. Some people like frame center, frame open, frame close, so you can also set that here as well. But that's pretty much it for my render settings. If I load some of these in, so you can see here with my EXR workflow, it's pretty much the exact same thing, except I've got the color output, my console variables are the same, and then my output stuff is the same. And for my naming convention, that is, if I go to this guy, I will do the file format, the aspect ratio or the landscape/portrait option, the resolution, whether it's 4K or you could do HD, Ultra HD, or you could just type in the resolution. And then I will also include the samples, so 1 spatial times 16 temporal. That way I'll know just from reading it. And you'll see here, this one, I have object IDs full, which is pretty much a cryptomat for the EXR. And again, you can check out my render passes video if you want to learn more about that. But I'll also add that into the title if I do have render passes included. Oh, and one thing, sorry, that I did forget is in deferred rendering, you want to make sure accumulator includes alpha if you are using your alpha stuff in this workflow, which is why we are changing that in the project settings. Is that everything? Now, the final thing before you go, I know I've definitely been waffling on way too much and over explaining things in this video, but I'll just quickly show you the different examples I have. So again, this is more of a studio setup with, you know, the kind of white background, and then my example B, this is more of like a product shot setup where I'll have, you know, my different lights and things like that here. Completely, by the way, all the same things, but you'll see here, I'm just using an HDRI backdrop. If I go to lights, HDRI backdrop, again, if it's for some reason not there, for me it is by default, but just go to your plugins and type in HDRI and it should be checked. If it's not, check it on. And then I've just got a gray HDRI as the background. But you can see here, this is more for like different product shots. You'll notice also I've named my cameras with different millimeter or focal lengths. That can be helpful as well sometimes. And for my third example, it's pretty similar, just a different kind of product and different style of lighting. It's something like this, a bit more of a contrasty lighting setup, and definitely handy to have this, you know, set up and ready to go. If you want this project to be an actual template that shows up in the Epic Games launcher when you hit launch, you totally can do that. Just check out this Unreal Engine documentation. They teach you how to do it. It's a super simple process, and that way whenever you start up a new project, you can have this as your base file setup. Hopefully this helps some of you out there with creating a base project so that you can just actually start doing the fun stuff in Unreal. Again, I know I was waffling on way too much and talking a bunch and over explaining things, but again, just trying to be helpful. See you guys in the next one. Peace.